I'm 67 years old, and for 38 years I've carried the guilt of being the only survivor of the most beautiful family that ever existed, destroyed because a single mother's love knew no boundaries between species, and federal agents saw that love as a threat to national security. Before this prostate cancer takes what little time I have left, I need someone to know about my mother, Sarah Chen, about the 12 years from 1983 to 1995 when she raised 2 sons in a cabin deep in the Olympic Mountains. 1 human child she'd given birth to, and 1 young Bigfoot she'd found starving and alone after hunters killed his parents. My name is Daniel Chen, and I grew up believing that having a Bigfoot brother was the most natural thing in the world, that families were defined by love rather than biology, and that the 3 of us could live forever in the wilderness sanctuary my mother had created to protect the most extraordinary child who ever walked the earth. What I learned on March 15, 1995, was that human civilization considers interspecies adoption a form of treason, and that government agencies would rather destroy innocent families than acknowledge that consciousness and love exist in forms they've never been brave enough to understand. My mother was 26 years old in 1983, recently divorced, struggling to support me on a nurse's salary while living in Seattle, when she made the decision that changed all our lives. She'd inherited 40 acres of remote forest land from her grandfather, complete with a cabin that had no electricity, no phone service, and no neighbors within 20 miles. Most people would have sold the property and used the money to improve their urban lifestyle. Sarah Chen saw it as an opportunity to raise her 5-year-old son away from the violence and corruption that seemed to define modern civilization. "I want you to grow up understanding that the natural world is sacred," she told me, while we packed our belongings for the move to what would become our permanent home. "Cities make people forget that we're part of something larger and more important than human convenience. In the forest, you'll learn what it really means to be alive." What my mother never expected was that our isolated sanctuary would become a refuge for someone else who needed protection from the cruelty that humans inflicted on beings they didn't understand. In September 1983, 6 months after we'd settled into our new life, she found a young Bigfoot, maybe 7 years old in human terms, hiding in our woodshed, starving and traumatized after watching hunters kill his parents with high-powered rifles equipped with scopes designed for long-distance shooting. He was so scared, my mother would tell me years later, when I was old enough to understand the courage it had taken to make the choice that defined our family. He'd been hiding for weeks, probably living on berries and stream water, too terrified to approach any humans but too young to survive alone in the wilderness. When I found him, I didn't see a monster or a creature or a specimen. I saw a child who needed a mother. Lucas, that's what we called him, though his real name in his people's language was a series of sounds my human throat could never reproduce. Became my brother in every sense that mattered. He was intelligent beyond anything I'd encountered in human children, capable of learning English with remarkable speed while teaching me about forest survival, animal behavior, and spiritual connections to the natural world that transformed my entire understanding of what life could be. For 12 years, from 1983 until 1995, we lived as the most loving family imaginable. My mother worked part-time as a visiting nurse for rural communities, providing just enough income to support our minimal needs while spending most of her time educating 2 boys who saw her as the center of their universe. Lucas and I were inseparable, brothers who shared everything, who protected each other from the dangers of wilderness living, who developed our own language of communication that transcended the boundaries between our species. But our happiness was built on a secret that would ultimately destroy us. Lucas's existence had to remain hidden from human civilization, which meant that I could never have normal friendships, never attend regular schools, never participate in activities that might lead to questions about our family structure. My entire childhood was spent protecting the brother I loved more than my own life, while knowing that discovery would mean losing everything that made our existence meaningful. The federal agents who finally found us on March 15, 1995, had been tracking reports of unusual large primate activity in the Olympic Peninsula for months. They came equipped with tranquilizer weapons, containment equipment, and authority that made resistance futile. What they discovered was a 13-year-old human boy and a 19-year-old Bigfoot, who'd been raised as brothers by a woman whose capacity for love had created the most extraordinary family in human history. What they did to that family, to my mother, to Lucas, to the bond that had sustained us for 12 years, destroyed my faith in human decency, and condemned me to spend the rest of my life knowing that the government I'd been taught to respect had murdered the best people I'd ever known. The prostate cancer that's killing me started growing the day they loaded Lucas into a containment vehicle, while my mother screamed for the son they were stealing from her arms. For 38 years, I've lived with the knowledge that somewhere in underground research facilities, my brother has spent his adult life as a test subject for people who will never understand that they're torturing someone who taught me what unconditional love really means. And I've lived knowing that my mother died in federal custody, officially from a heart attack, but actually from the grief of watching her family destroyed by people who saw our love as a threat to institutional control over information about consciousness and intelligence. September 12, 1983, started as one of those Pacific Northwest mornings when mist hangs thick between old-growth Douglas firs, and the air carries the promise of rain that would define our first autumn in the Olympic Mountains. I was 5 years old, still adjusting to life in a wilderness so remote that the nearest neighbor lived 20 miles away, when my mother and I discovered that we weren't the only ones seeking sanctuary in the ancient forests that surrounded our grandfather's cabin. We were gathering firewood behind our property when Mom heard sounds that immediately triggered her nursing instincts, soft whimpering that carried the unmistakable distress of someone young, frightened, and desperately in need of help. The sounds were coming from our woodshed, a structure my grandfather had built for storing split logs, but that had remained empty since our arrival 6 months earlier. "Stay behind me, Danny," Mom whispered while approaching the shed with the cautious movements of someone who understood that frightened beings could be dangerous when cornered. "Something's hurt in there, and we need to be gentle so we don't make the situation worse." What we found challenged everything my 5-year-old mind thought it knew about the world. Huddled in the far corner of the woodshed, partially concealed behind stacks of old lumber, was a child who looked like something from the fairy tales Mom read to me at bedtime, but whose suffering was heartbreakingly real and immediate. He was enormous for someone who was clearly very young, maybe 4 feet tall, covered in reddish-brown fur that was matted with dirt and dried blood, with proportions that suggested he belonged to a species I'd never encountered in any of my picture books. But his face, despite features that were obviously non-human, held expressions of fear and sadness that were unmistakably familiar to anyone who'd ever seen a lost child. "Oh, sweetheart," my mother breathed, her voice carrying the same tone she used when I woke up from nightmares. "How long have you been hiding here? Where are your parents?" The young Bigfoot's response was immediate and profound. Instead of fleeing or showing aggression toward humans who might represent additional threats, he began making sounds that were clearly attempts at communication, vocalizations that rose and fell like questions, like pleas for help from someone who understood that he was dying, but didn't know how to ask for assistance. My mother's medical training took over immediately. Moving slowly to avoid triggering panic responses, she began assessing his condition with the systematic approach she'd learned during years of pediatric nursing. He was severely malnourished, showing signs of dehydration that indicated he'd been surviving on minimal resources for an extended period. More disturbingly, he had injuries that suggested violent trauma rather than accidents related to wilderness survival. "Danny, go to the house and bring me the first aid kit from the bathroom," Mom instructed while examining wounds on the young Bigfoot's arms and shoulders. "Also bring some milk and those crackers from the kitchen. This child hasn't eaten properly in a very long time." I ran to the cabin and returned with supplies, amazed to find that the frightened creature had allowed my mother close enough to begin cleaning wounds that were clearly infected. He watched her work with the focused attention of someone evaluating whether help had finally arrived or if his situation was about to become worse. "Someone hurt you badly," my mother observed while treating cuts that appeared to be bullet wounds, shallow grazes that suggested he'd been shot at, but had escaped before more serious damage could be inflicted. "Were you with your family when it happened? Are they looking for you?" The young Bigfoot's reaction to questions about his family was heartbreaking and immediately conclusive. He began making sounds that were unmistakably grief, crying that conveyed loss so profound that even a 5-year-old could understand its meaning. His parents were gone, probably killed by the same people who'd shot at him, leaving him alone in wilderness that challenged adult survival skills. "We're going to take care of you," my mother promised while offering milk that he accepted with obvious gratitude. "You're safe now, and we'll figure out how to help you find other members of your people or give you a home with us until that becomes possible." But even as she made this commitment, Mom understood the enormity of what she was volunteering to undertake. Caring for a young Bigfoot would require resources we could barely afford, knowledge about his species' dietary and medical needs that didn't exist in any textbook, and absolute secrecy that would isolate our family from human civilization for as long as he remained with us. "Mom, is he going to live with us now?" I asked while watching the young Bigfoot consume food with the careful attention of someone whose survival had depended on making every calorie count. "I think so, Danny," she replied, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who'd made an irreversible decision based on moral conviction rather than practical considerations. "He needs a family, and we need to learn what it means to love someone who's different from us, but who deserves protection just like any other child." That afternoon, my mother began the process that would transform our small family into something unprecedented in human history. She moved the young Bigfoot into our cabin's spare bedroom, creating sleeping arrangements that accommodated his larger size while ensuring his comfort and security. She began researching nutrition and medical care that might meet his species' requirements. Most importantly, she started teaching him basic English while encouraging him to teach us about his own people's culture and knowledge. By evening, the frightened creature we'd found hiding in our woodshed had become Lucas, the brother I'd never known I needed, whose presence would make the next 12 years the most extraordinary period of my life. The transformation of Lucas from traumatized refugee to beloved family member happened gradually over the autumn and winter of 1983, as my mother's natural maternal instincts combined with her medical training to create the most nurturing environment any abandoned child could imagine. What emerged was not just a successful interspecies adoption, but a family structure that challenged everything I thought I knew about love, intelligence, and what kinds of bonds could exist between beings from different evolutionary paths. Lucas was remarkably intelligent in ways that surpassed any human child I'd encountered during my later education. Within weeks, he'd mastered basic English vocabulary and was communicating complex thoughts through combinations of words, gestures, and expressions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of abstract concepts. More than language acquisition, he showed emotional intelligence that made him sensitive to my mother's moods, my childhood fears, and the subtle dynamics that made our isolated family function harmoniously. He understands things about people that most adults never learn, my mother observed while watching Lucas comfort me after I'd fallen and scraped my knee during one of our forest explorations. He knows exactly how to help without making someone feel weak or dependent. That's a gift that comes from natural empathy, not from education. The daily routines Lucas established revealed both his adaptability and his inherent wisdom about wilderness living. He taught us about medicinal plants that could treat injuries and illnesses more effectively than anything in my mother's medical kit. He showed us food sources that could sustain us during winter months when supply runs to town became impossible due to snow and road conditions. Most remarkably, he demonstrated weather prediction abilities that allowed us to prepare for storms days before conventional forecasting could provide accurate warnings. But beyond practical contributions, Lucas brought joy to our family that transformed our isolated cabin from a simple survival shelter into a genuine home. He had a sense of humor that transcended species boundaries, creating games and entertainment that kept us laughing during the long winter evenings when darkness fell by 4 p.m. He was endlessly curious about human culture, asking questions about books, music, and traditions that made me see my own species through fresh perspectives. "Why do humans make music?" Lucas asked one evening while listening to my mother play guitar beside our wood stove. "Animals make sounds for territory and mating, but human music seems different. It makes feelings change without changing anything else." These conversations became the foundation of an education that prepared both Lucas and me for understanding the world in ways that conventional schooling could never provide. My mother created lesson plans that combined traditional academic subjects with wisdom that Lucas shared about his people's knowledge systems. their understanding of forest ecology, and their spiritual relationships with natural cycles that connected them to consciousness, larger than individual existence. Lucas's memories of his biological family gradually emerged through patient conversations that revealed both the sophistication of Bigfoot culture and the tragedy that had made our adoption possible. His people lived in extended family groups that managed territories spanning hundreds of square miles, using sustainable harvesting methods and conservation practices that maintained ecosystem balance while supporting community needs. My parents were teachers, Lucas explained through the increasingly sophisticated English that my mother encouraged him to develop. They taught young ones about forest medicine, about reading weather signs, about respecting the spirits that live in old trees. When the hunters came, my father tried to talk to them, tried to make them understand that we meant no harm to humans. They killed him while he was trying to make peace. The hunters who destroyed Lucas's family were part of organized expeditions that specifically targeted Bigfoot populations for capture or elimination, motivated by both scientific curiosity and the kind of fear that drove humans to destroy anything they couldn't understand or control. Lucas had escaped only because his mother had hidden him in a cave system, while she led the hunters away from his location, sacrificing her own life to ensure her son's survival. She told me to wait for 3 days, then find humans who might help. Lucas continued, tears streaming down his face as he relived trauma that would affect him for the rest of his life. She said not all humans are killers, that some would protect children if they understood that children need protecting. When I found you and Danny's mother, I remembered her words and decided to trust instead of hiding. My mother's response to Lucas's story revealed the depths of love and protective instinct that would sustain our family through 12 years of secrecy and isolation. She gathered both her sons into her arms and promised that our home would always be a sanctuary, where love mattered more than species, where intelligence was respected regardless of its biological origins, and where family bonds were defined by choice rather than genetics. "You're my son now," she told Lucas with the absolute conviction that characterized all her important decisions. "Danny is your brother and I'm your mother, and nothing will ever change that. We'll learn together how to build a life that honors both your people's wisdom and human knowledge, and will protect each other from anyone who tries to destroy what we've created." The winter of 1983 to 84 became a time of profound bonding that established the emotional foundation for our unconventional family. Lucas learned to read from the same books that had taught me, discovering human literature while sharing stories from his people's oral traditions that had been passed down through generations of forest dwellers. We celebrated both human holidays and the seasonal ceremonies that connected Lucas to his cultural heritage, creating hybrid traditions that belonged uniquely to our family. But even as our happiness deepened, my mother understood that our secret carried enormous risks. Lucas's existence had to remain hidden from human civilization, which meant that any contact with outside authorities could result in his capture and our family's destruction. The love that sustained us also made us vulnerable to people who would see our interspecies adoption as evidence of criminal activity, rather than the most beautiful relationship any of us would ever experience. Living with Lucas meant living with constant vigilance against discovery by people who would see our family as a curiosity to be exploited, rather than a loving relationship that deserved protection. By 1990, when I was 12 and Lucas was 14, maintaining our secret had become increasingly difficult as his size and obvious non-human characteristics made concealment problematic during the rare occasions when we encountered other people during supply runs or medical emergencies. My mother had developed elaborate strategies for keeping Lucas hidden while ensuring he didn't feel isolated or ashamed of his appearance. She'd modified our cabin with concealed spaces where he could retreat if unexpected visitors appeared, created detailed cover stories to explain any unusual sounds or evidence of his presence, and established protocols for emergency situations that might require immediate evacuation to deeper wilderness areas. But the most challenging aspect of protecting our secret was the emotional toll of enforced isolation on all 3 family members. I couldn't attend conventional schools or develop friendships with human children, which meant my entire social development was limited to interactions with my mother and Lucas. While this created an extraordinarily close family bond, it also left me unprepared for navigating relationships with people outside our isolated sanctuary. Lucas faced even greater challenges as he entered adolescence without contact with others of his species. He'd grown to nearly 7 feet tall and was clearly developing into the magnificent being he was meant to become. But he had no models for understanding adult relationships, cultural traditions, or the responsibilities that his people would have expected him to assume as he matured. "I don't know how to be who I'm supposed to be," Lucas confided during one of our evening conversations beside the wood stove that had become our family's gathering place. "Your mother teaches me about human culture, and you're my brother in every way that matters, but I don't know what it means to be an adult of my people. I don't know their ceremonies, their wisdom, their ways of understanding the world." My mother's response demonstrated both her love for Lucas and her growing concern about the long-term sustainability of our family structure. She'd been researching Bigfoot reports from throughout the Pacific Northwest, hoping to establish contact with other communities that might welcome Lucas while allowing our family to remain connected. But her investigations had attracted attention from exactly the people we needed to avoid. Federal agencies monitoring cryptid activity had begun noticing patterns in her research inquiries, her geographic movements, and her purchases of supplies that exceeded what a small family would normally require. By 1993, our family was under surveillance by teams equipped with technology designed to detect unusual large primate activity in wilderness areas where humans were known to reside. The pressure intensified when Lucas began showing romantic interest in the concept of finding a mate and starting his own family. At 19, he was clearly ready for adult relationships that couldn't be satisfied within our human household. But approaching other Bigfoot communities would require revealing our location and potentially exposing us to federal agents who'd been systematically hunting his people for decades. "I want to find a wife and have children," Lucas told my mother during a conversation that broke all our hearts. "But I don't want to leave you and Danny, because you're my family and I love you more than I can express in either language. How do I choose between the life I need and the people who've given me everything?" My mother's response revealed the impossible situation our love had created. Lucas needed contact with his own species to complete his development and fulfill his biological and cultural destiny. But seeking that contact would probably result in federal discovery of our family and the destruction of the relationships that had sustained all of us for more than a decade. "Maybe it's time for us to try finding other families like yours," she suggested, knowing that the search would be incredibly dangerous, but understanding that Lucas's needs had to take priority over our security. "We've kept you safe for 10 years, and now we need to help you find the life you deserve to live." The investigation that followed my mother's attempts to locate other Bigfoot communities created exactly the digital footprint that federal agencies had been monitoring. Her communications with cryptid researchers, her purchases of specialized camping equipment, and her travel patterns through areas with reported Bigfoot activity generated algorithmic alerts that triggered increased surveillance of our family. By late 1994, we were being watched constantly by teams that used thermal imaging, motion sensors, and audio recording equipment to document activities around our cabin. The simple life we'd built in the Olympic Mountains had become the subject of a federal investigation that treated our family as a national security threat rather than a loving relationship that deserved constitutional protection. The final crisis came when Lucas decided he couldn't continue hiding, while other members of his species were being hunted and captured by the same agencies that were monitoring our family. His protective instincts, the same qualities that had made him a wonderful brother and son, demanded that he try to warn other Bigfoot communities about federal hunting operations. "I can't stay safe while my people are being hurt," Lucas explained while preparing to leave our sanctuary for the first time since 1983. "They need to know about the hunting teams, about the equipment being used to track them, about the safe places where families like ours might find protection." My mother's attempt to prevent Lucas from exposing himself to federal capture led to the confrontation that would destroy our family. On March 15, 1995, when she physically tried to stop Lucas from leaving our cabin to warn other Bigfoot communities, federal agents monitoring our property decided that their surveillance had gathered sufficient evidence to justify direct intervention. The love that had created our family became the evidence that guided military operations designed to capture specimens, whose existence represented strategic opportunities that bureaucrats valued more than the lives of innocent beings who'd committed no crime, except loving each other across species boundaries. March 15, 1995, dawned gray and cold, with the kind of Pacific Northwest wind that carries the scent of snow from mountain peaks and makes even the most familiar forest feel dangerous and unpredictable. I was 17 years old enough to understand that the argument between my mother and Lucas about his planned departure to warn other Bigfoot communities had attracted the attention of federal agents who'd been monitoring our family for months. The confrontation began at 06:30 hours, when specialized teams surrounded our cabin with equipment designed for capturing dangerous wildlife rather than conducting normal law enforcement operations. Agent Collins, the federal coordinator, had brought tranquilizer weapons, containment vehicles, and enough firepower to ensure that resistance would be futile regardless of Lucas's size and strength. "Sarah Chen, you're harboring an unidentified biological entity in violation of federal wildlife protection statutes and national security protocols," Collins announced through amplified speakers while his teams established perimeter control around our property. "You have 10 minutes to surrender the specimen in your custody and submit to federal detention for comprehensive debriefing." My mother's response revealed the courage that had sustained our family for 12 years. Instead of cooperating with people who saw Lucas as a specimen to be collected, she positioned herself between federal agents and the son she'd raised from childhood, speaking with the authority of someone whose love gave her strength beyond physical capabilities. "His name is Lucas, and he's my son," she called back while Lucas and I took positions that demonstrated our commitment to protecting each other regardless of the cost. "He's not a specimen or an entity or a biological curiosity. He's a person with feelings and intelligence and the same rights to life and freedom that you'd demand for your own children." But federal agencies had been planning this operation for months, studying our family dynamics and preparing for exactly the kind of resistance we were offering. They'd brought specialists in managing cryptid capture situations who'd developed protocols for separating human families from the beings they'd chosen to protect. Lucas made the choice that sealed all our fates. Despite our pleas for him to retreat deeper into the forest where he might escape federal capture, he stepped forward to surrender himself voluntarily, rather than allow my mother and me to be harmed during operations designed to secure his detention. "I won't let them hurt my family because of me," Lucas said with the dignity that had characterized everything about his behavior since childhood. "Sarah gave me 12 years of love and safety when my own people couldn't protect me. I won't repay that kindness by letting her be injured because I was too cowardly to accept responsibility for the danger my presence has created." Agent Collins's response demonstrated the mindset that made negotiation impossible. Subject: "You're an unidentified biological entity that poses potential threats to ecological stability and national security. You'll be detained for comprehensive study by qualified research personnel who can determine your scientific and strategic value." What followed was the systematic destruction of the most loving family I'd ever known. Lucas was tranquilized despite offering no resistance, loaded into containment equipment designed for transporting dangerous animals to research facilities where he would spend the remainder of his life as a test subject for studying cognitive development, linguistic capabilities, and potential military applications of non-human intelligence. My mother's breakdown as they loaded Lucas into the transport vehicle was complete and devastating. She fought federal agents with the fury of someone whose child was being stolen, screaming for them to release the son she'd raised with 12 years of unconditional love, trying to throw herself between Lucas and his captors while he called her name in both English and his people's language. "Mom, Danny!" Lucas cried as the drugs took effect, his last words before unconsciousness expressing love and gratitude for the family that had saved his life and given him 12 years of happiness. Remember that families are forever, even when they can't be together. Remember that love makes us the same species. The final betrayal came when Agent Collins offered me a choice that revealed the full scope of their operations. I could accompany my mother to federal facilities where we'd be detained indefinitely, while providing information about Lucas's development and capabilities, or I could accept placement in foster care and witness protection that would erase our family's existence from official records. Your mother will receive appropriate medical care during her debriefing process, Collins explained while federal agents prepared to transport my mother to detention facilities, designed for people whose knowledge represented security risks. If you cooperate fully with our investigation, she'll be released when we've gathered sufficient data about the specimen's cognitive and physical characteristics. I chose cowardice, standing in the ruins of our cabin while they loaded the two people I loved most into separate vehicles. I accepted witness protection that preserved my physical safety while condemning my family to fates worse than death. I was relocated to foster care in another state, given a new identity, and spent the next 30 years pretending that the most important relationships of my life had never existed. My mother died in federal custody 6 months later, officially from a heart attack, but actually from the grief of watching her son stolen from her arms by people who would never understand that they'd destroyed something holier than anything they'd encounter in their lifetimes. She never saw Lucas again, never learned whether he survived the initial research procedures, never had the opportunity to say goodbye to the child she'd loved for 12 years. Lucas disappeared into underground research facilities, where he spent 30 years as a test subject for studying intelligence, consciousness, and potential military applications of non-human cognitive abilities. He's 45 years old now. Assuming he survived 3 decades of scientific study designed to unlock whatever secrets his biology might reveal about evolution, genetic engineering, and strategic capabilities that bureaucrats fantasize about controlling. For 38 years, I've lived with the knowledge that my family was destroyed because a single mother's love knew no boundaries between species, and because federal agencies considered that love a threat to institutional control over information about consciousness and intelligence. The prostate cancer killing me is justice for a coward who chose safety over loyalty when his brother needed protection most. Somewhere in government facilities that don't officially exist, Lucas spends his days remembering 12 years of love while enduring decades of scientific torture by people who will never comprehend that they're studying someone who taught me what family really means.